Look closely at the walls in Cusco and you'll notice something strange. The best stonework is at the bottom. The foundations show incredible precision. As you move up, the quality declines. That's backwards. Technology usually improves over time. Skills develop, techniques get refined. Here, it looks like builders were trying to copy something they didn't fully understand. Stand on Hatun Rumiok Street in Cusco and run your hand across the wall. You can't feel where one stone ends and another begins. The transition is seamless. If you weren't looking directly at it, if the stones weren't slightly different shades, you might think you were touching a single continuous surface. But these aren't small bricks joined with precision mortar. These are multi-ton blocks of volcanic stone, each carved into complex polygonal shapes. Some have 6 sides, some have 8, some have 12 or more. And every single one of those angled surfaces had to fit perfectly against the corresponding surface of an adjacent stone. The joints are so tight you genuinely cannot slide a piece of paper between the centered knot, in most places. The fit is that exact. Researchers who have studied these walls describe the precision in careful terms, avoiding specific measurements they can't verify. But the visual evidence is undeniable. These are hairline joints, extremely tight fits, the kind of precision that would challenge even modern stonemasons. But precision is only part of what makes these joints remarkable. They're not just flat surfaces meeting at right angles. Many of these joints are three-dimensionally complex. A single seam might curve gently as it runs vertically. The face angle might change subtly along that curve. One stone might protrude slightly while its neighbor recedes, creating an interlocking effect. The 12-angled stone is the most famous example, but it's hardly unique. All along this wall, you'll find stones with 6, 8, 10 faces, each face carefully shaped to match its neighbor. The stone doesn't just fit into a rectangular hole. It fits into an irregular three-dimensional space defined by multiple other irregular stones. Think about what that means practically. To create the 12-angled stone, you're not carving a simple shape. You're creating 12 separate planes. Each one has to be flat enough to create that hairline joint. Each one has to meet the adjacent planes at exactly the right angle. And all 12 have to be correct simultaneously, because if even one surface is off by more than a millimeter or two, the stone won't seat properly. Now expand that problem. The 12-angled stone interfaces with at least 6 adjacent stones. Each of those stones also has multiple angled faces. The total number of precisely matched surfaces involved in fitting this single stone into position is somewhere around 30 to 40. How do you accomplish that? The mainstream archaeological explanation involves a process of careful template making and incremental fitting. This is based largely on the experimental work of Jean-Pierre Protzen, an architect and researcher who spent years studying Inca construction techniques in the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds. Protzen demonstrated that with patience and skill, stonemasons could create templates, mark stones, shape them through grinding and pecking, and test fit them repeatedly until achieving tight joints. His work is important because it shows that the basic techniques are possible. Given enough time and skilled labor, you can create precisely fitted polygonal masonry using Bronze Age tools. Every time you test fit a multi-ton stone, you have to lift it, position it, assess the fit, remove it, grind down the high spots, and repeat. With a 6-ton stone, that's an enormous physical undertaking for each iteration. The risk of damage increases with every movement, and you're essentially working by approximation, estimating how much material to remove and from where. This trial and error method might work for rough fitting. It's much harder to explain how you achieve the hairline precision visible on these walls. The speaks pros: tolerances are too tight, the surfaces are too complex. There are too many simultaneous constraints. In 2019, a computer scientist created a 3-dimensional model of a section of the Hatun Rumiok wall, including the 12-angled stone. He wrote algorithms to try to determine the optimal sequence for placing stones and the measurements each would require. even with computational assistance. Assuming perfect measuring tools and the ability to carve to exact specifications, he found that the complexity of the fitting problem exceeded what should be reliably solvable without modern methods. His conclusion wasn't that the walls are impossible. It was that either the Inca had measurement, planning techniques far more sophisticated than we credit them with, or they used methods we don't fully understand yet. The joints themselves offer another clue. Some researchers have noted that certain joints appear to have subtle angle changes within a single seam. The face angle might shift slightly as you trace the joint downward. This creates an even more complex fitting challenge. You're not just matching planes, you're matching curves and transitions in 3 dimensions. What we're looking at is either extraordinary skill and patience taken to a level that seems inefficient, or techniques that were more advanced than the tools we've found would suggest. The evidence for the pecking and grinding method exists. Protzen proved it can work, but whether it fully explains what we see on walls like this one remains an open question. The best current interpretation is that the Inca, or whoever built these foundations, had sophisticated fitting methodologies that likely included template systems, master craftsmen with specialized knowledge, and possibly measuring techniques that haven't been documented or understood yet. The methods worked, that much is clear from the results. But if we can't fully explain how basic joints were achieved with the precision we observe, how do we explain everything else? Because the joints are just the beginning. These aren't small stones. Some of the stones in these walls weigh over 120 tons. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the weight of a modern main battle tank. A single stone, moved into position, fitted precisely against its neighbors, and somehow lifted into place in a structure that stood for centuries. The Inca had no wheels, no pulleys that we found evidence of, no iron tools, no written engineering manuals. They were, from a technological standpoint, barely into the Bronze Age. And yet they worked with stones that would challenge modern construction equipment. Walk 3 kilometers up the hill from Cusco to Sacsayhuaman, and the scale becomes even more staggering. The massive lower courses of the fortress walls feature stones estimated at over 200 tons. These aren't refined, carefully cut blocks. They're massive, irregularly shaped boulders that have been precisely fitted together despite their enormous size. One stone at Sacsayhuaman is estimated at around 120 to 140 tons. It sits in the lowest course of the main wall. Multiple stones around it exceed 100 tons. They're arranged in a zigzag pattern that serves both defensive and structural purposes, interlocked so tightly that 5 centuries of earthquakes haven't displaced them. These massive stones weren't quarried on site. The evidence suggests they came from locations several kilometers away, which means they had to be moved across varied terrain, through areas that would have been difficult to navigate, even without carrying impossible loads. But perhaps the clearest example of the transport problem comes from Ollantaytambo, about 60 kilometers northwest of Cusco in the Sacred Valley. The Temple of the Sun at Ollantaytambo features 6 massive monoliths of pink granite. Each stone weighs between 50 and 70 tons, though estimates vary. They're fitted together with the same hairline precision we see in Cusco, creating a wall that appears seamless despite the enormous mass of its components. Here's the problem. The quarry where these stones came from is on the opposite mountain, across the Urubamba River Valley. The distance is several kilometers. The route involves crossing the river, navigating valley floor terrain that would have been unstable and potentially marshy, and then ascending switchbacks up the mountainside to the construction site. Modern engineering would approach this with hydraulic cranes, specialized heavy transport vehicles, engineered roads capable of bearing extreme loads, and extensive planning using computer modeling. The logistics would be complex even with all those resources. The Inca had none of that. The conventional explanation involves massive labor forces using rope systems, wooden rollers, and possibly ramps. Researchers estimate that moving a 50-ton stone would require hundreds of workers, elaborate rope networks, and carefully prepared routes. But here's where the evidence gets thin. There's no clear archaeological evidence of roads or ramps at Ollantaytambo capable of supporting this kind of transport. The geography of the Espa Valley doesn't show obvious signs of the massive earthwork that would be required. And some stones appear to have been abandoned part-way along potential routes, suggesting that transport attempts sometimes failed. The valley floor would have presented particular challenges. The Urubamba River isn't a calm, easily crossed waterway. While it's possible that stones could have been rafted across during certain seasons, a 50 to 70-ton block on a raft is an enormous engineering challenge. One mistake and the stone sinks, lost forever. Some abandoned stones exist near the river, which could indicate failed attempts. But many stones did make it across. They're standing at the temple site right now, which means someone solved this problem. We're just not entirely sure how. There's another puzzling aspect to the transport question. Why choose stones from such difficult-to-access quarries? At many sites throughout the Sacred Valley, local stone is available. Not always the same type or quality, perhaps, but sufficient for construction. Yet the builders consistently chose to source specific types of stone from distant, difficult locations. The pink granite at Ollantaytambo, the andesite for Cusco's walls, some of it brought from quarries kilometers away. The massive stones at Sacsayhuaman transported from distant sources. Either they had specific reasons for wanting those particular stone types, or they were working within constraints we don't understand. Perhaps they were reusing existing quarries established by predecessors. Perhaps certain stones had symbolic or practical significance that made the extra effort worthwhile. The mainstream explanation for transport involves scaling up simple technologies. Enough rope, enough rollers, enough workers, enough time, and you can move almost anything. The physics works in theory. Historical examples from other cultures show that massive stones can be moved with relatively simple tools and enormous effort. But theory and documentation are different things. We have limited archaeological evidence for exactly how these specific stones were moved over this specific terrain. The routes aren't well preserved. The infrastructure that would have been needed hasn't been found in most cases. What we do have are Spanish chronicles that mention something interesting. When the conquistadors asked the Inca about the greatest structures and the largest stones, the Inca often claimed they didn't know how those particular monuments were built. They attributed them to earlier peoples or to mythical figures. This could be cultural myth-making. It could be Spanish misunderstanding of Inca oral traditions. Or it could suggest that even the Inca themselves weren't entirely sure how the most impressive elements were accomplished. The best current interpretation is that massive organizational capacity, combined with techniques we don't fully document, allowed for transport of these enormous stones. The alternative possibility that some of the largest megalithic elements predate the Inca and were incorporated into later construction would also explain some of the transport mysteries. Either way, what's clear is this: moving the stones was an enormous challenge. Modern engineers acknowledged they would have difficulty replicating some of these feats, even with contemporary equipment, not because it's physically impossible, but because the logistics are so complex and the margin for error so small. Moving stones is one problem. Shaping them is another, because these aren't just heavy, they're hard. Try to scratch steel with a copper penny, you won't make much progress. The copper is too soft. It will deform and wear away before it makes any meaningful mark on the harder material. That's essentially what we're told the Inca did when they carved these walls. They used bronze tools to shape andesite, a volcanic rock that's significantly harder than bronze. The hardness of materials is measured on the Mohs scale, where higher numbers indicate harder materials. Andesite, the stone used extensively throughout Cusco and the Sacred Valley, rates around 6 to 7 on the Mohs scale. Bronze, the hardest metal the Inca had access to, rates around 3 to 4. The general rule is that you can't effectively cut or carve a material with a tool that's softer than that material. The tool will wear away faster than it shapes the stone. So how did they do it? The answer, according to mainstream archaeology, is that they didn't use bronze to carve andesite directly. They used hammerstones made of even harder metamorphic rocks, and they employed techniques of pecking and abrasion. This is where Jean-Pierre Protsen's experimental work becomes crucial. Protsen didn't just theorize about Inca stoneworking techniques, he went to Peru and tested them. He obtained the types of stones the Inca would have used, both for working and for carving. He employed traditional techniques, and he documented the results. His findings show that hammerstones made of harder rock can shape andesite. The technique involves repeated percussive strikes, pecking away at the surface gradually. It's time-consuming and labor-intensive, but it works. Protsen demonstrated that skilled workers can shape stone this way, creating relatively flat surfaces and controlled angles. Archaeological evidence supports this. Hammerstones have been found at quarry sites throughout the region. The tools existed, the technique was real. But here's where the explanation starts to strain. Pecking creates a surface texture. The repeated impacts from hammerstones leave characteristic marks. You're abrading the surface away bit by bit, which produces a slightly rough, pocked appearance. With enough time and effort, you can smooth this surface through grinding and polishing, but the process has inherent limitations. Some of the stone surfaces in Cusco are extremely smooth. When you run your hand across certain sections of wall, especially around the most precise joints, the surface feels almost polished. It's not rough. It's not visibly pocked. It's smooth enough that you can barely detect the transition from one stone to another. Did pecking and grinding produce this? Possibly. With exceptional skill and enormous patience, fine finishing is achievable. But the scale of the work is staggering. We're not talking about a few showpieces. We're talking about tens of thousands of stones, many with multiple precisely finished surfaces. There's another observation that complicates the picture. On some stones, researchers have noticed something unusual. There appear to be smooth surfaces that were deliberately roughened afterward. You can see what looks like a finer, smoother substrate with pocking marks overlaid on top. Why would builders create a smooth surface and then deliberately roughen it? One explanation is that this was done to help plaster or other materials adhere to the surface. In other ancient cultures, stones that would be plastered were sometimes roughened for better adhesion. This is a documented technique. It's not mysterious, but it does suggest a more complex process than simple pecking from start to finish. It implies multiple stages: initial shaping, precision fitting and smoothing, and then selective surface treatment for specific purposes. The toolkit question extends beyond just shaping. There are other features on these stones that raise questions. Many blocks have protruding knobs or bosses. These are deliberately shaped protrusions, sometimes quite large, left on the surface of otherwise finished stones. The standard explanation is that these were lifting bosses, attachment points for ropes used to move the stones. This makes sense for some regular, symmetrically placed knobs, but many of the knobs we see are irregularly placed. Some are on surfaces where they wouldn't be useful for lifting. Some stones have knobs on what would be the top surface, which doesn't fit the lifting boss theory. Alternative explanations have been proposed, including symbolic or decorative purposes, but the truth is, we're not entirely certain what all these knobs represent or how they were created. What we can say is this: the available evidence shows that hammerstones and pecking techniques can work. Protsen proved it experimentally. The method is feasible, but whether it fully explains the range of surface finishes, the volume of work accomplished, and all the details we observe remains a matter of some debate among researchers. Some archaeologists are comfortable saying the mystery is essentially solved. Hammerstones plus skilled labor plus time equals these results. Others are more cautious, noting that our understanding of the complete toolkit and the full range of techniques is still incomplete. We know some of what they did. We may not know all of it. The best current interpretation is that the techniques worked, but our documentation of the exact processes may be missing details. Specialized knowledge held by master craftsmen might have included refinements, tricks of the trade, and methods that weren't obvious or didn't preserve in the archaeological record. What's not in dispute is the result. These stones were shaped. They were shaped precisely. And they were shaped by people working with pre-industrial technology. Even if we accept that the tools could work, there's still the timeline problem. Because these walls weren't built in isolation, they're part of a much larger construction program. And the pattern of how they were built tells a strange story. If you look closely at these walls, you'll notice something that seems backwards. The best stonework is at the bottom, the worst is at the top. In most technological development, we see improvement over time. Early attempts are crude. Later efforts refine the techniques. Quality increases as builders learn and improve. Here, it's reversed. The most precise, most sophisticated stonework forms the foundations. Later additions are progressively simpler and cruder. This pattern appears consistently across sites throughout the Sacred Valley, and it raises an uncomfortable question about who actually built what. The Peruvian researcher Alfredo Gamarra developed a classification system for the different architectural styles visible in Cusco and the surrounding region. His son, Jesus Gamarra, has continued this work. While not all archaeologists accept their entire framework, the basic observation of distinct construction styles is hard to dispute once you know what to look for. They identify three main categories. Han Pacha refers to architecture carved directly from living bedrock. You find this at sites where the natural rock of the mountain itself has been shaped into steps, altars, channels, and other forms. This work often appears extremely eroded, as if it's very ancient. Some surfaces show unusual characteristics, smooth sections that look almost melted or vitrified, though the cause of this appearance is debated. Urin Pacha is the megalithic stonework we've been discussing. Large blocks of andesite, or granite, brought from quarries, precisely fitted together without mortar. This is the style that features the hairline joints, the complex polygonal shapes, the protruding knobs. It's what most people think of when they think of Inca architecture, though whether it's actually Inca-built is part of the question. Ukun Pacha is clearly Inca period construction. Smaller stones, local cobblestones, often joined with mud mortar. The precision is much lower. Gaps are visible between stones. The overall quality doesn't approach what we see in the Urin Pacha megalithic work. Now here's the pattern. When you find these styles together, which you do frequently throughout Cusco and the Sacred Valley, they appear in a specific order. The Han Pacha bedrock carving is the lowest and apparently oldest layer. When megalithic Urin Pacha construction is present, it's built around and on top of the Han Pacha work, often in a way that seems protective and respectful of the older carved bedrock. The Ukun Pacha Inca-style work is built on top of or around both earlier styles, clearly added later. Even within the Urin Pacha megalithic category, there's variation. The finest, most precise blocks tend to be in the foundations and lowest courses. As walls rise, the quality sometimes declines. Upper courses may show larger gaps, less complex shapes, cruder finishing. This is exactly backward from what you'd expect if the same culture was developing and refining a technique over time. At Sacsayhuaman, this pattern is stark. The massive lower courses feature stones of incredible size and precision. Some of these blocks are over 100 tons, fitted together with complex angles and hairline joints. They're essentially impossible to move without modern equipment, yet there they are, precisely placed. The upper courses, which clearly came later, are dramatically different. Smaller stones, less precision, visible gaps filled with smaller rocks. It's still good stonework by most standards, but it's not the same quality as the foundation. At Ollantaytambo's Temple of the Sun, you can walk behind the famous 6 monoliths and see crude stonework that looks almost primitive compared to the precision granite megaliths forming the main wall. This rougher work is clearly an attempt to build around and support the massive stones, but it doesn't match their quality. The conventional explanation for this pattern is that it represents different functions. Foundations needed to be stronger, so they got better stonework. Visible courses could be less precise. Different teams worked on different sections. These are possible explanations, and there's certainly precedent in other cultures for varying quality based on function. But there's a problem with this interpretation. If the Inca were developing these techniques during the reign of Pachacuti in the mid-1400s, we should see a learning curve. Early attempts should be cruder. Later work should show refinement and improvement. Master stonemasons should be training apprentices, spreading knowledge, improving methods over time. Instead, we see the opposite. The finest work appears to be the oldest, buried deepest in the foundations. Later additions show reduced quality, not improvement. There's also no clear evidence of a practice phase, no sites where you can see experimental work or failed attempts at this level of precision. The megalithic construction appears fully developed from the start, with no obvious precursors. One way to explain this pattern is through catastrophic knowledge loss. Perhaps the Inca did develop these techniques, reached a peak of sophistication, and then something disrupted the knowledge transmission. Master craftsmen died without fully training replacements. Social upheaval interrupted the apprenticeship system. The techniques were lost within a generation or two. This is possible. Knowledge can be lost, especially when it's transmitted orally and through hands-on training rather than being written down. We have examples from other cultures of sophisticated techniques being lost when circumstances disrupted their transmission. The alternative explanation is that the Inca didn't develop these techniques at all. They inherited them. They found structures that were already built, partially ruined, and they did their best to maintain, repair, and add to what they found. This would explain several things simultaneously. It would explain why the best work appears oldest. It would explain why there's no visible learning curve. It would explain why later Inca construction is clearly different in quality and technique. And it would explain something else we'll get to shortly. What the Inca themselves said about these structures. The pattern appears across too many sites to be coincidence. At Pisac, at Kenko, at sites throughout the Sacred Valley, you see the same layering. Ancient carved bedrock at the base, megalithic precision stonework built around it, cruder Inca period additions on top. The best current interpretation acknowledges that either there was a dramatic loss of specialized knowledge between generations, which is possible but would require explaining what caused such sudden and complete loss, or the construction represents multiple building phases, possibly separated by significant time, with the Inca serving as inheritors and renovators rather than original builders of the most sophisticated elements. There's no scientific consensus on this question. Most mainstream archaeology attributes all the construction to the Inca period. A minority of researchers, including some engineers and architects who've studied the sites, find the succession scenario more convincing given the physical evidence. What's not disputed is the pattern itself. The quality gradient is real. You can observe it at site after site, and it shows degradation over time, not improvement. This pattern is telling us something, either about catastrophic knowledge, loss, or about succession and inheritance. But whatever the explanation, it's clear that sophisticated construction knowledge was not widely distributed and was definitely lost. This raises another question. These walls aren't just evidence of skill, they're evidence of massive organizational capacity. Someone had to plan all this. Someone had to coordinate the quarrying, transport, shaping, and fitting of tens of thousands of stones across multiple sites. And that brings us to the question of how any of this was possible without the very tools that make large-scale construction manageable. The walls themselves are impossible enough. But getting them here? That creates whole new problems. The quarry for Ollantaytambo's Temple of the Sun is on the opposite mountain, across the Urubamba River Valley, up switchbacks carved into steep terrain, several kilometers from the construction site. Look across the sit to Valley from Ollantaytambo and you can see it, the quarry site, where massive blocks of pink granite were extracted. Some still remain there, partially worked, abandoned for reasons we can only guess. Getting those stones from there to here should have been nearly impossible. The route involves crossing the valley floor, which historically would have been unstable, ground prone to flooding, then crossing the Urubamba River itself, which even in dry seasons is a significant waterway, then ascending steep switchbacks up to the temple site, which sits on a mountainside terrace hundreds of feet above the valley floor. Modern engineers looking at this route point out that you would need engineered roads capable of bearing extreme concentrated loads. You'd need bridge infrastructure to cross the river. You'd need multiple crews and heavy equipment. You'd need careful planning and probably months of preparation for each stone. The Inca had none of these things, and yet the stones are here. 6 massive monoliths standing at the Temple of the Sun, each weighing an estimated 50 to 70 tons, made of pink granite that came from that quarry across the valley. How? The conventional explanation involves rope systems, wooden rollers, and massive labor mobilization. Hundreds of workers pulling in coordinated teams, possibly rafts or pontoon bridges to cross the river during favorable conditions, temporary ramps built and then dismantled after use. All of this is theoretically possible. The physics works. Other cultures have moved heavy stones using similar, simple technologies. The question isn't whether it could be done in principle. The question is whether we have good evidence it was actually done this way in this specific context. And that evidence is surprisingly limited. The valley floor doesn't show clear signs of ancient roads engineered to handle these loads. No substantial ramp remnants have been identified along the most logical routes. The riverbank areas don't preserve obvious infrastructure for stone transport. Now, absence of evidence isn't conclusive. Wooden rollers rot away. Rope systems leave no trace. Temporary ramps could have been dismantled and the materials reused. Centuries of erosion, flooding, and landscape change could have erased signs of transport infrastructure. But there's another piece of evidence that complicates the picture. Some stones were abandoned. Near the quarry and at points along potential transport routes, researchers have found partially worked stones that appear to have been left in place. Some are quite large. They show evidence of initial shaping but were never completed and moved to their final positions. These abandoned stones could indicate that transport attempts sometimes failed, that the effort was too great, or the stone broke, or something went wrong in the logistics. This suggests the process was difficult and not always successful. Yet many stones did make it. The temple stands as proof that whatever challenges existed, they were overcome often enough to complete at least part of the intended structure. There's another puzzling aspect to the quarrying itself. At Ollantaytambo, you can see what's called the Wall of Living Rock, where the quarry face shows clear extraction marks. The cuts are remarkably clean. The surfaces left behind are smooth, and many of these extraction sites are high up on the cliff face, more than 130 feet above the valley floor in some locations. Why quarry stones from such difficult-to-access positions? How were the stones lowered from these heights without damage? Modern quarrying would use cranes and carefully engineered lowering systems. What did the ancient builders use? We don't have clear answers. There are no obvious ramp systems preserved on the quarry face. No clear evidence of the infrastructure that would be needed to lower multi-ton blocks down a vertical cliff face safely. The same pattern appears at other sites. At Sacsayhuaman, stones were brought from quarries several kilometers away. The exact routes aren't well documented. The method of transport remains debated. Some researchers have suggested that the Inca used a technique of rocking stones back and forth on curved bases, essentially walking them slowly along prepared paths. This might work for moving stones short distances. It seems less practical for multi-kilometer transport over varied terrain. Others have proposed more elaborate rope and timber ramp systems, scaled up from techniques that are known to work with smaller stones. Again, possible in principle, but hard to verify archaeologically. And then there's the question of why certain stones were chosen in the first place. Local stone is available at most of these construction sites. Not always the same type or quality as what was imported, but sufficient for building. Yet the builders consistently chose to source specific stone types from distant, difficult-to-access locations. The pink granite at Ollantaytambo, specific types of andesite for Cusco's walls. The massive stones at Sacsayhuaman quarried from sites that required significant transport, effort. Either they had very specific reasons for wanting those particular stone types, aesthetic preferences, symbolic significance, physical properties, or they were working within constraints we don't understand. Perhaps they were following existing quarry traditions established by earlier builders. There's something else worth noting in the Spanish chronicles. Multiple sources mention that when conquistadors asked the Inca about the great structures and how they were built, the Inca often expressed uncertainty about the most impressive elements. They attributed major monuments to earlier peoples or to the work of mythical figures associated with the creation of the world. This could be cultural, storytelling. Many societies attribute ancient monuments to gods or legendary heroes. It could also be Spanish misunderstanding or misrepresentation of what they were told, but it's worth considering the possibility that it might be literally true, that the Inca themselves weren't entirely certain how some of these monuments were created because they inherited them rather than building them from scratch. If that's the case, the transport mystery becomes even more complex. It might not be one question, but two different questions layered on top of each other. How did the original builders move these stones? And how did the Inca modify, repair, and add to what they found? The best current interpretation acknowledges that massive organizational capacity was required, that simple technologies scaled up with enough labor can accomplish remarkable things, but that our specific documentation of methods is incomplete. The alternative possibility that some of the most difficult transport was accomplished by earlier builders using techniques that weren't preserved remains open for some researchers, though not widely accepted in mainstream archaeology. What's clear is this: the logistics were extraordinary, the challenges were real, and the fact that it was accomplished at all demonstrates capabilities that continue to impress even modern engineers. But here's another problem. Moving the stones is one challenge. Knowing exactly where to put them and how they fit together is another. And that requires planning. Detailed, complex, three-dimensional planning. The kind of planning that typically requires written records, mathematical notation, and the ability to work out problems on paper before committing to them in stone. The Inca had none of those things. To fit the 12-angled stone into its position in the Hatun Rumiok wall, every one of its 12 surfaces had to match adjacent stones perfectly, all at once. If even one surface was off, the stone wouldn't seat properly, and you'd have to start over or make compromises that would reduce the precision. Each of those 12 surfaces meets at least one other stone, often multiple other stones. And those stones also have multiple angled faces that need to align with their neighbors. This isn't a simple jigsaw puzzle. This is a three-dimensional fitting problem where you can't see all the constraints at once, where pieces weigh tons and can't be easily manipulated, and where mistakes are extremely costly. How do you plan this without written mathematics? Without the ability to draw accurate diagrams? Without calculating angles on paper and working out the geometry before you commit to carving? The Inca had no written language, no paper, no mathematical notation system that we've discovered in the archaeological record. Knowledge was transmitted orally and through apprenticeship. Plans, if they existed, would have been in the minds of master builders, or perhaps represented through physical models or templates. Modern construction planning for anything this complex would use computer-aided design software. Architects would model the entire structure digitally, work out stress points and load distribution, calculate precisely how each element fits with its neighbors, and generate detailed specifications for workers to follow. Even before computers, complex architecture required extensive written plans, mathematical calculations, and drawn diagrams. The Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe were built using detailed architectural drawings and geometric knowledge that was written down and transmitted through guilds. How do you accomplish similar complexity without any of that? The answer, according to mainstream archaeology, involves template systems, physical models, and master craftsmen who held sophisticated knowledge in their heads and passed it down through hands-on training. This isn't impossible. Human memory and spatial reasoning are remarkable. Master craftsmen in many pre-literate societies have accomplished sophisticated work through oral transmission and apprenticeship. Medieval cathedral builders in some periods worked with limited written documentation, relying heavily on tradition and practical experience. The template theory suggests that builders created physical templates, possibly from wood or other materials, that represented the shapes needed for particular stones. These templates could be tested against already placed stones. New stones could be marked based on the templates and then carved to match. This method works for relatively simple shapes. But the polygonal masonry of Cusco involves stones that interface with multiple neighbors in 3 dimensions. The 12-angled stone doesn't just sit against one other stone. It touches at least 6 others, each contact requiring precision. How do you create templates for that? How many templates would you need? And there's another constraint. You can't carve stones in complete isolation and then bring them all together at the end. The fitting has to be incremental. You place some stones, then you carve the next stone to fit against what's already there. But that means the next stone's shape is constrained by multiple previous decisions. The problem compounds with each stone you add. In 2019, a computer scientist named Ruben de Jong created 3-dimensional models of sections of the Hatun Rumiok wall. He tried to determine what planning and measurement would be required to achieve the fits we see. His conclusion was that even with perfect measuring tools and the ability to carve to exact specifications, the complexity exceeds what should be reliably achievable without computational assistance or very sophisticated geometric knowledge. He wasn't arguing it's impossible. He was noting that either the builders had measurement and planning methods significantly more advanced than we typically credit Bronze Age societies with, or they were using techniques we don't yet understand. One possibility is that there were planning methods that simply haven't survived in the archaeological record. Knotted cords, quipu, were used by the Inca for record keeping and might have encoded more complex information than we currently understand. Physical models might have been used and later destroyed or lost. Geometric knowledge might have been sophisticated but transmitted entirely orally. Another possibility, suggested by some researchers, is that the fitting process wasn't as difficult as we imagine because the builders had methods of adjustment we don't know about. Some have proposed that stones might have been roughly shaped at the quarry, transported to the site, and then finished in place with final adjustments made through careful grinding and fitting. This would reduce the number of test fitting cycles needed. Instead of carving a stone to perfect specifications and hoping it fits when you move it into position, you'd carve it to approximate specifications, place it, and then refine it in situ. The challenge with this theory is that grinding away material from a multi-ton stone that's already in position is difficult. You need access to all the surfaces that require adjustment. Some of these surfaces are on the bottom or back of stones, not easily accessible once the stone is placed. Still, it's possible that a combination of methods was used. Rough shaping at the quarry, transport to site, more detailed shaping with the stone near its final position, placement with lifting systems that allowed some access to contact surfaces, final adjustments through careful grinding, specialized tools or techniques for checking alignment that haven't been preserved or recognized. What we do know is that the planning was somehow accomplished. The walls exist. The fits are real. Thousands of these precisely fitted stones are standing in Cusco and throughout the Sacred Valley. The mainstream view is that this represents sophisticated empirical knowledge held by specialized craftsmen. They understood geometry practically even if they didn't write it down. They used templates, physical models, string and stake layouts, and accumulated experience to solve the planning problems. The methods were adequate for the task, even if we can't fully document every detail of how they worked. The alternative view, held by some engineers and researchers who've studied the sites, is that there are gaps in this explanation, that some aspects of the planning and fitting seem to require knowledge or techniques that go beyond what simple templates and empirical methods should allow, that we might be missing important pieces of how this was actually done. Either way, the planning problem was solved, somehow, and the result is walls that have stood for centuries. But planning is one thing, execution is another. And some of these walls show features that are difficult to explain even with perfect planning. Some stone surfaces in Cusco show unusual characteristics that don't quite match what we'd expect from the documented techniques. Walk along various walls and you'll notice variation in the surface finishes. Some stones have visible pocking marks, the characteristic texture you'd expect from hammerstone pecking. Other stones are smoother, much smoother, almost polished in places. This variation isn't random. Often within the same wall, you'll see stones with different surface characteristics. Some appear to have rough surfaces, as you'd expect from pecking and grinding. Others have surfaces so smooth that when you run your hand across them, they feel almost glassy. What accounts for this difference? One explanation is simply different levels of finishing. Perhaps some stones were intended to be more visible or more important, and therefore received extra polishing. Perhaps different work teams had different standards or skill, 2 levels. Perhaps the variation represents different construction phases with changing techniques or priorities. All of these are plausible. Surface finishing can vary for many reasons, but there's another observation that's harder to explain through simple variation in finishing effort. On some stones, you can see what appears to be a smooth substrate with pocking marks overlaid on top. It looks as though the surface was originally smooth and was deliberately roughened afterward. You can sometimes see this transition, where a smoother undersurface is visible and then pocking marks have been added. Why would builders create a smooth surface and then deliberately make it rougher? The most straightforward explanation is that this was done to help materials adhere to the surface. In other ancient cultures, stones that would be plastered were often roughened to create better adhesion. The smooth surface would be the result of careful shaping and fitting. Then, once the stone was in place, selected surfaces would be roughened so that plaster or stucco could be applied. This is a known technique. It's not mysterious, and it makes functional sense. But it does tell us something important about the process. It suggests that there was an initial smooth finish achieved during the fitting phase. This smoothness would require careful work, perhaps with fine abrasives or polishing. Then, after placement, some surfaces were deliberately textured. This implies a more complex process than simply pecking away at stone until it roughly fits. It suggests precision work followed by selective surface treatment. There's another feature that raises questions: the protruding knobs or bosses that appear on many of the megalithic stones. The standard explanation is that these are lifting bosses, attachment points for ropes used to move stones. This makes sense for regularly placed, symmetrical knobs. Ancient builders in many cultures used lifting bosses. They're practical for handling large stones. But many of the knobs we see on Cusco's stones don't fit this pattern. Some are irregularly placed. Some are on surfaces where they wouldn't be useful for lifting. Some stones have knobs on what would be the top surface when in position, which doesn't match the lifting boss theory. Alternative explanations have been proposed: symbolic or decorative purposes, structural reasons we don't understand, remnants of an earlier construction phase that were left in place when stones were repurposed. The honest answer is, we're not entirely certain what all these knobs represent. Some probably were for lifting, others might have served different purposes. The variation in their placement and characteristics suggests they weren't all created for the same reason. One thing we can observe is that the surfaces around these knobs are often carefully finished. The The knobs aren't just rough protrusions, they're shaped forms integrated into otherwise precisely worked surfaces. This suggests they were intentional features, not just convenient handholds left over from quarrying. Another surface characteristic worth noting: some stones show what appear to be very fine, almost parallel marks or striations. These could be tool marks from the finishing process. They could be natural features of the stone, accentuated by weathering. Interpreting these features requires careful analysis, and different researchers sometimes reach different conclusions. What we can say with confidence is this: the surface conditions of stones in Cusco vary in ways that suggest a multi-stage process. There was rough shaping, probably through pecking and abrading with hammerstones. There was precision fitting that required creating smooth, accurate surfaces at contact points. There may have been final polishing or finishing in some cases. And there was sometimes deliberate roughening for functional purposes after placement. The mainstream interpretation is that all of this is consistent with Bronze Age stoneworking techniques, just applied with exceptional skill and effort. The methods existed. They worked. The variation we see represents different stages of the process and different functional requirements. Some researchers, particularly those with engineering backgrounds, are less certain. They note that some of the surface finishes seem finer than what pecking and grinding typically produce. They observe features that don't quite match expected tool signatures. They point to precision that seems to exceed what simple templates and trial and error fitting should reliably achieve. These concerns don't prove anything definitively. They suggest that our understanding of the complete toolkit and the full range of techniques might be incomplete. That there could be refinements or methods that weren't obvious, didn't preserve in the archaeological record, or were specialized knowledge held by a small group of master craftsmen. The best current interpretation acknowledges that the techniques involved multiple stages: rough shaping at quarries using hammerstones, transport to sites, precision fitting requiring careful measurement and fine-tuning, surface finishing that varied based on purpose, and possibly later modifications or additions by subsequent builders. What's not in dispute is the result. These surfaces exist, the precision is real, and whatever techniques were used, they worked well enough to create stonework that has lasted for centuries and continues to impress anyone who examines it closely. The methods are one mystery. But there's another question that's equally puzzling: the timeline. Because according to the official history, all of this supposedly happened in one man's lifetime. And that claim creates its own set of problems. Emperor Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, the ninth Sapa Inca, ruled from approximately 1438 to 1471 CE. That's roughly 30 years. In that time, according to mainstream Andean archaeology, he transformed Cusco from a regional center into an imperial capital, initiated the construction of Machu Picchu, built or rebuilt sites throughout the Sacred Valley, and oversaw a massive expansion of Inca territory and power. He's credited with being one of history's great empire builders. The Inca expansion that led to the largest pre-Columbian empire in the Americas is largely attributed to his vision and organizational genius. And according to the conventional timeline, pretty much all the sophisticated stonework we've been discussing was accomplished during his reign or shortly after. Let's think about what that means in practical terms. Conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands of precisely fitted polygonal stones across multiple major sites. Cusco itself has extensive megalithic walls. Sacsayhuaman involves massive fortification walls with stones exceeding 100 tons. Ollantaytambo has the Temple of the Sun and other significant structures. Pisac, Chinchero, Cuenco, and dozens of other sites all feature sophisticated stonework attributed to this same period. We've seen from experimental archaeology that creating even relatively simple polygonal stones is extremely labor-intensive. We've noted the challenges of quarrying, transport, shaping, and fitting. Now multiply that by tens of thousands of stones across dozens of sites, and try to fit it into a 30-year period. The mainstream explanation is that this was possible through massive mobilization of labor. The Inca had a tribute labor system called mita, where communities owed labor service to the state. During Pachacuti's reign and the reigns of his immediate successors, this system was used to organize enormous workforces. Thousands of workers could be deployed simultaneously across multiple projects. With enough workers, enough organization, and careful planning, you can accomplish remarkable things in a short time. The scale of the achievement reflects the organizational sophistication of the Inca state, not impossibility. This explanation works up to a point. Large-scale construction with massive labor mobilization is well documented in other ancient societies. The pyramids of Egypt, the Great Wall of China, Roman aqueducts and roads all represent enormous projects accomplished through organized labor over relatively short periods. But there are some things about the Cusco timeline that don't quite fit this pattern. First, there's no clear evidence of a practice phase or technique development period. When new construction technologies emerge, you typically see a learning curve. Early attempts that are less refined. Experimental approaches that get abandoned. Gradual improvement as methods are perfected. The megalithic polygonal masonry of Cusco appears fully developed from the start. The earliest examples we can identify show the same level of sophistication as later ones. There's no obvious progression from crude to kapik, refined, from experimental to mastered. Second, the quality doesn't degrade across different sites in a way that would suggest learning or improvement. If teams were developing these techniques during Pachacuti's reign, you might expect variation between early projects and later ones. But the stonework at different sites is consistently sophisticated. No clear pattern of improvement or refinement over time. Third, within individual sites, we have the quality gradient problem we discussed earlier. The finest work is in the foundations. Later additions show reduced quality. This is backwards from how technique development normally works. Fourth, the sheer volume of work seems difficult to reconcile with the experimental evidence for how long this stonework takes to create. Even with massive labor forces, even with skilled craftsmen, the timeline feels compressed. Now, none of this proves that the conventional timeline is wrong. It's possible that the Inca had already developed these techniques before Pachacuti's reign, and he simply mobilized them at an unprecedented scale. It's possible that our experimental replications underestimate how efficiently experienced workers could operate. It's possible that the organizational capacity of the Inca state at its peak was sufficient to accomplish what seems logistically improbable to us. But there's another piece of evidence worth considering, something the Inca themselves said about these structures. And what they said challenges the conventional attribution in an interesting way. When Spanish chroniclers arrived in Peru, in the 1,530 seconds and 1,540 seconds, they were amazed by what they found. The stonework of Cusco and the Sacred Valley impressed them deeply. They wrote extensive descriptions of the architecture, the precision, the scale of the construction. And when they asked the Inca who built these structures, they got a surprising answer. The Inca said they didn't know. This appears in multiple Spanish sources. Pedro Chiesa de Leon, writing in the 1,550 seconds based on direct observation and interviews with Inca informants, described great walls and structures that the Inca themselves attributed to a time before their empire. He reported that the Inca spoke of earlier builders with knowledge and capabilities that were not fully understood by their descendants. Garcilaso de la Vega, himself of Inca royal descent and writing in the early 1600s, made similar claims. He stated that the most impressive stonework was ancient even to the Inca, who did not know the methods by which it was created. Now, we need to be careful with Spanish chronicles. The Spanish had their own biases and agendas. They often misunderstood indigenous beliefs and practices. They sometimes deliberately misrepresented what they were told to justify conquest or to fit Christian worldviews, and indigenous oral histories often include mythological elements. Attribution of great works to gods or legendary figures is common across cultures. It doesn't necessarily mean literal claims of earlier civilizations, but multiple independent Spanish sources report similar stories. And the Inca accounts they recorded often distinguished between structures the Inca built and older structures they inherited or modified. Some structures were clearly attributed to recent Inca rulers. The chroniclers recorded which emperor built which palace or temple. But the greatest megalithic works, particularly the most impressive foundations, were often attributed to earlier times or to mythical figures associated with creation. There's physical evidence that supports at least some succession in construction. Remember the pattern we discussed of the first 7 high Incas, each establishing their palaces by rebuilding or repurposing existing megalithic courtyards, while later Incas built with local cobblestones. This suggests that when the Inca established their capital in Cusco, there was a limited supply of suitable megalithic structures already present. The first rulers could each claim one of these existing courtyards and rebuild it for their use. But by the time of the 8th Inca, there were no more suitable existing structures available, so new palaces had to be built using different, simpler techniques. This pattern makes perfect sense if the Inca found a partially ruined megalithic city and made it their capital. It makes much less sense if they built everything from scratch during their own reign. There's also the quality gradient we keep coming back to. If the Inca were developing these techniques during their empire, why is the best work at the foundations? Why does quality decline over time rather than improve? And there's the radiocarbon dating issue. The dates that place this construction in the 15th century come from organic materials found in mortar, fill, and other contexts associated with the structures. But these dates only tell us when organic material died. They don't directly date when stones were carved. If the Inca were modifying, repairing, or building around pre-existing megalithic structures, adding new mortar, creating new fill layers, building upper courses on top of older foundations, all the radiocarbon dates would capture that Inca period activity. They wouldn't necessarily tell us anything about when the original megalithic foundations were created. So what's the alternative timeline? If some of these structures predate the Inca, who built them and when? The honest answer is, we don't know. There's no clear archaeological evidence for the identity of pre-Inca megalithic builders in the Cusco region. We know there were earlier cultures. The Quilca culture occupied the Cusco Valley before the Inca, and there's evidence of even earlier occupation, but we don't have clear evidence linking those cultures to megalithic construction at this level of sophistication. Some researchers have proposed that the megalithic tradition might be significantly older than commonly attributed, possibly connected to earlier Andean cultures like Tiwanaku, which shows similar stoneworking sophistication and dates to around 500 to 1000 CE, possibly earlier. Tiwanaku, located in Bolivia near Lake Titicaca, features precisely fitted megalithic stonework with some characteristics similar to what we see in Cusco. The connection is speculative, but it at least demonstrates that sophisticated stone working existed in the Andean region before the Inca period. The succession scenario would work something like this. Earlier builders, possibly associated with Tiwanaku or another culture we don't fully understand, created megalithic structures in Cusco and the Sacred Valley. These structures were built with sophisticated techniques and considerable effort. At some point, perhaps due to social collapse, conquest, or other disruption, the sites were partially abandoned or destroyed. When the Inca arrived in Cusco around 1200 CE, they found these partially ruined megalithic structures. Recognizing their value, they made the location their capital. They repurposed the existing megalithic courtyards and walls. They built new structures around and on top of the ancient foundations. They repaired what they could using the techniques available to them, which produced good, but not megalithic quality results. Over time, particularly during Pachacuti's reign, they expanded dramatically, adding their own constructions throughout the region. The radiocarbon dates we have capture this period of Inca activity, not the original construction of the megalithic foundations. This scenario explains the quality gradient, the palace pattern, The Spanish chronicles, the lack of a visible learning curve, and the timeline compression problem. It doesn't require impossibly rapid development of sophisticated techniques. It doesn't require attributing knowledge to the Inca that we have no other evidence they possessed. But it does require accepting that there are significant gaps in our understanding of pre-Inca Andean history, and it requires being willing to question conventional archaeological timelines. Mainstream archaeology generally rejects this succession scenario. The reasoning is that the radiocarbon evidence points to the 15th century. The historical sources attribute the empire's expansion to Pachacuti, and there's no clear archaeological evidence for a pre-Inca megalithic culture in Cusco specifically. The Inca were capable of sophisticated engineering, as evidenced by their extensive road networks, their agricultural terraces, their irrigation systems. Why couldn't they also be capable of megalithic construction? The organizational capacity was clearly there. The labor force was available. The motivation existed. Attributing the work to unknown earlier builders when we have a documented, capable civilization right there seems unnecessary. This is a fair perspective, and it's the consensus view in Andean archaeology. But a minority of researchers, including some engineers, architects, and archaeologists who've studied the sites extensively, find the physical evidence more consistent with the succession scenario. They point to the pattern of construction quality, the technological discontinuities, the Spanish chronicles, and the challenges of the conventional timeline. There's no scientific consensus. The debate continues. What we can say is that the physical evidence can support multiple interpretations, depending on what assumptions you start with. What's not in dispute is that whether the Inca built these structures or inherited them, specialized knowledge was involved. Sophisticated understanding of stoneworking, structural engineering, and construction planning. And that knowledge, however it originated, was clearly lost. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 1532, the Inca were no longer building with the precision of the great megalithic walls. Later Inca construction shows a clear decline in sophistication from the finest megalithic work. Buildings attributed to the immediate pre-conquest period use smaller stones, rougher techniques, and often incorporate mortar. The precision fitting of massive polygonal blocks was no longer being practiced at the highest level. How does a civilization lose its most advanced capabilities? This is actually not as unusual as it might seem. Knowledge loss has happened repeatedly throughout history, often for well-documented reasons. The Romans made concrete that could set underwater and has lasted for over 2,000 years. The exact formula was lost after the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and it took until the modern era to fully understand and replicate their techniques. The knowledge was held by specialized craftsmen and engineers whose traditions were disrupted by the empire's fall. Damascus steel, renowned for its strength and distinctive patterns, was produced in the Middle East for centuries. The techniques were lost around the 18th century when the ore sources changed and the knowledge of the specific processes failed to transmit to new generations. Gothic architecture involved sophisticated stone cutting and structural engineering. When the Renaissance shifted architectural tastes and the guild system that transmitted this knowledge began to break down, many specific techniques were lost or had to be rediscovered later. In all these cases, knowledge loss happened because the knowledge was specialized, held by relatively small groups of craftsmen or engineers, and transmitted through apprenticeship and oral tradition, rather than written documentation. When the social or economic structures that supported these guilds and training systems were disrupted, the knowledge went with them. The Inca had no written language. All technical knowledge was transmitted orally and through hands-on apprenticeship. If stoneworking was a specialized craft, possibly controlled by specific guilds or lineages, the number of people who fully understood the most advanced techniques might have been quite limited. The Spanish conquest was catastrophically disruptive. The Inca Empire collapsed rapidly. The social structure was shattered. Elite classes were decimated. Religious and administrative systems were destroyed. Enormous numbers of indigenous people died from disease, war, and forced labor. In this context, the loss of specialized knowledge is entirely plausible. If the master stone workers were killed, if the apprenticeship systems were disrupted, if the economic and social support for their work disappeared, the techniques could easily be lost within a single generation. And there's evidence this happened not just to stoneworking, but to many Inca technologies and practices. Traditional agricultural knowledge, textile technique, metal working methods. Much was lost during the conquest and had to be reconstructed later from incomplete evidence. So whether the Inca developed the megalithic techniques themselves or inherited them from earlier builders, the loss of this knowledge is entirely consistent with what we know about how specialized knowledge is transmitted and how it can be lost during social disruption. There's another possibility worth considering. Even before the Spanish conquest, there might have been earlier disruptions. If the megalithic builders were a pre-Inca culture, their own collapse or decline could have caused a loss of knowledge that the Inca never fully recovered. The Inca might have inherited structures whose construction methods were already only partially understood. This would explain why the Inca repaired and modified these structures, but often didn't match the original quality. They were working with incomplete knowledge, doing the best they could with techniques they understood, but unable to fully replicate the sophistication of what they'd inherited. What we can observe is a clear pattern of knowledge that existed at some point, produced remarkable results, and then was lost. The finest stonework clearly came first. Later work shows progressive decline. And by the time the Spanish arrived, even the Incas' own accounts sometimes expressed uncertainty about how the greatest structures were made. This knowledge loss, whether it happened during the Spanish conquest or earlier, represents one of the great tragedies of Andean history. We have the results of sophisticated engineering, but we've lost the complete understanding of the methods. We can study the walls, measure them, analyze them with modern technology, but we can't fully reconstruct how they were built because the knowledge wasn't written down and the people who held it are long gone. What we've lost may be as significant as what remains. The walls themselves are evidence of capabilities we can observe but not entirely explain. They're reminders that knowledge can be fragile, that it can be lost, and that sometimes all that survives is the work itself, standing silent while we try to puzzle out how it was done. But there's one thing these walls do tell us clearly, one aspect of their construction that we can verify and understand. They've worked for centuries, and their survival proves something important about the builders, whoever they were. May 21st, 1950. A powerful earthquake strikes Cusco. 5. Strong enough to cause significant damage throughout the city. Colonial buildings, some nearly 400 years old, suffer severe damage. Adobe structures, the most common building material in the region, collapse. Churches crack, walls tumble, people die in the destruction. And the Inca walls stand. Not just stand, they're virtually undamaged. The massive stones of Sacsayhuaman don't budge. The precise polygonal masonry of Cusco's streets remains intact. The megalithic foundations that have supported colonial buildings continue to do exactly what they've been doing for centuries, bearing loads and distributing stress without failing. This isn't ancient history or archaeological speculation. This is documented modern observation. Engineers and architects who examined the city after the earthquake noted the stark contrast between the colonial damage and the slowly survival of the Inca stonework. It's happened repeatedly. Earthquakes in 1650, 1950, and other years have damaged colonial and modern structures while leaving the megalithic walls essentially intact. Why? Recent engineering studies, including seismic modeling and structural analysis of walls at Sacsayhuaman and other sites, have provided insights into how this architecture achieves its remarkable seismic resistance. This multidirectional force distribution prevents any single stone from being displaced. The walls can essentially flex during earthquakes. Individual stones might shift by tiny amounts, but the overall structure remains stable. The lack of mortar, which seems like a weakness, is actually a sophisticated engineering solution. These are principles that modern seismic engineering recognizes and even incorporates into contemporary design. Base isolation, friction damping, allowing structures to move rather than resisting all forces. These are sophisticated concepts that emerged in the 20th century as we developed better understanding of how structures behave during earthquakes. The builders of these walls, whether Inca or their predecessors, were applying similar principles empirically. They observed how different wall types performed during earthquakes. They refined their designs. They arrived at solutions that worked, not through mathematical calculation or computer modeling, but through experience and careful observation. This demonstrates sophisticated engineering understanding, not supernatural knowledge, not lost technology that we can't comprehend, just sophisticated, empirically derived engineering applied with great skill. The walls prove that the builders understood seismic resistance at a practical level that took modern engineers centuries to formalize mathematically. They didn't need to understand the physics equations. They needed to observe what worked and what didn't, and they needed to be willing to invest enormous effort into construction methods that achieved superior results. This is perhaps the clearest, most verifiable aspect of these structures. We can test them. We can model them. We can observe their performance in actual earthquakes, and they work exactly as sophisticated seismic engineering would predict. Does this prove the Inca built them? Not necessarily. Sophisticated engineering could have been developed by earlier Andean cultures and inherited by the Inca. But it does prove that whoever built these walls, they understood earthquake-resistant design principles at a very high level. The survival of these walls through centuries of seismic events is not mysterious. It's the result of excellent engineering. The mystery is not why they stand. The mystery is how that engineering knowledge was developed and applied with the tools and capabilities available at the time. The walls answer one question while raising many others. They prove the builders were sophisticated engineers. They demonstrate that empirical knowledge can achieve results that match or exceed what formal mathematical approaches produce. They show that enormous investment in quality construction pays off over centuries, but they don't answer who exactly did the building, when the techniques were first developed, how knowledge was transmitted, or why it was eventually lost. And that's exactly where we still stand today. Colonial buildings damaged, megalithic walls surviving. That's recorded history, not speculation. We know the Inca were capable builders. Their roads, terraces, irrigation systems, and administrative structures demonstrate sophisticated engineering and organizational capacity. They were not primitive. They accomplished remarkable things. And we know that within Bronze Age technological constraints, stoneworking techniques existed that could produce results like these. Jean-Pierre Protzen's experimental work demonstrated that hammerstones can shape andesite. Templates can guide fitting. Skilled craftsmen can achieve precision through patience and expertise. Those are the certainties. Now, what remains unresolved? The timeline questions. Whether all this construction really happened in the compressed period it's attributed to, or whether it represents longer development, or whether some structures were inherited rather than built by the Inca. The quality gradient. Why the finest work appears to be the oldest, why later additions show decline, and what this pattern tells us about development versus succession. The complete toolkit. We know some techniques. We may not know all of them. There might be methods that weren't preserved or recognized in the archaeological record. The planning methods. How three-dimensional fitting problems this complex were solved without written mathematics or computational tools. The transport logistics. The routes. The methods. The infrastructure that allowed movement of massive stones across difficult terrain. And the succession accounts, what the Spanish chronicles mean when they report Inca uncertainty about the greatest structures. Whether these should be understood as literal history, cultural mythology, or something in between. These aren't small questions. They're fundamental to understanding the history and capabilities of Andean civilizations. Mainstream archaeology has answers to most of these questions. The Inca built these structures during their imperial expansion using sophisticated organizational capacity and Bronze Age techniques scaled up through massive labor. Mobilization. The quality variation represents different functions or work teams. The Spanish chronicles reflect myth and misunderstanding. The timeline is supported by radiocarbon dating. This is the consensus view, and it's backed by substantial evidence and reasoned interpretation. But there are researchers, including archaeologists, engineers, and architects, who've studied these sites extensively, who find aspects of this explanation incomplete, who note discontinuities in the physical evidence, who point to challenges in the conventional timeline, who take the Spanish chronicles more literally. Their alternative interpretations aren't conspiracy theories. They're reasoned challenges to conventional dating and attribution, raising questions about whether we've correctly understood the sequence and authorship of construction. There's no consensus on these alternatives. They remain minority views, but they exist within legitimate, scholarly debate, not outside it. What we can say definitively is that these structures challenge our assumptions about what Bronze Age societies were capable of, about how knowledge develops and transmits, about what gets preserved in the historical record and what gets lost. These aren't impossible walls. Nothing about them violates physics or requires technologies that couldn't exist in their time period. But they are walls that push the boundaries of what we typically expect from pre-industrial construction. They demonstrate capabilities at the high end of what's technically possible. They show sophistication that required deep understanding, whether that understanding came through empirical observation or inherited tradition. The Smithsonian Institution has published high-resolution 3D scans of some of this stonework online. Anyone can access them. Anyone can study them. Maybe the answers are waiting in data we haven't analyzed yet. Maybe new archaeological discoveries will clarify timelines. Maybe advances in dating techniques will give us better chronological resolution. Or maybe some aspects of this mystery are unsolvable because the knowledge was never written down and the people who held it are gone. What's certain is that dismissing these walls as simple or fully explained doesn't do them justice. They represent significant achievements. They deserve serious study and honest acknowledgement of what we understand and what we don't. The walls in Cusco aren't waiting for us to solve them. They've been standing for centuries, surviving earthquakes that leveled buildings around them, outlasting the empire that claimed to build them or inherited them. Despite our laser scanners, our computer models, our engineering analyses, and our extensive research, significant questions remain. We can explain why the walls work. We can't fully explain every aspect of how they were built, by whom, or exactly when. The precision is real. The scale is documented. The survival is undeniable. The explanation is still incomplete. And that incompleteness should make us humble about how much we know, about how much has been lost, about how much might still be waiting to be understood. These walls stand in Cusco right now, silent, precise, massive, absolutely real. 500 years of earthquakes haven't moved them. Centuries of weather haven't eroded them beyond recognition. The Spanish conquest didn't destroy them, though it destroyed so much else. They're still there, still fitted together with hairline precision, still bearing loads, still distributing seismic forces exactly as sophisticated engineering would predict, still challenging us to understand how they came to be.